They told you she was untouchable. They told you she was flawless. They told you she was the golden girl of Hollywood. But behind the glittering smiles and perfect photographs hides a storm so dark, so twisted, so filled with betrayal that when the truth explodes, it will shatter everything you thought you knew about her and about the lies that built her empire. Under the flashing lights of Hollywood, where every smile is rehearsed and every photograph is polished to perfection, a storm was quietly brewing, and the world had no idea that beneath the sparkling gowns and the carefully curated interviews, there existed a network of manipulation, betrayal, and deceit so deep that once it began to unravel, it could never be stopped. And at the center of this chaos stood a woman who had been elevated to the status of perfection by the very machine that was now threatening to expose her every secret, and with each whisper that spread behind closed doors, with each hushed conversation. In dimly lit restaurants and with each leaked message, the illusion of untouchable beauty began to fracture into something darker, something more sinister, something that would haunt every person involved, because the story was never about one accusation or one scandal. It was about the way power collides with desperation, the way truth is twisted until it no longer resembles reality, and the way reputations can be destroyed overnight. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the plot grew thicker. The lies grew louder, and the games being played behind the scenes became too dangerous to ignore. She was accused, she was defended, she was worshipped, and she was despised all at once. And every person who touched this story left with scars of their own, because the betrayal was not one-sided. It was not clean, it was not simple. It was a web spun with the threads of greed, envy, revenge, and survival, and each thread pulled tighter around her until she could hardly breathe. But still she fought. Still she clawed her way through the headlines and through the courtroom filings and through the endless parade of so-called allies who used her pain as currency. And every step she took was met with more shocking revelations, more contradictory testimonies, more evidence that this was not just about her, but about the entire system that propped her up and sought to tear her down. And the deeper we look, the more horrifying it becomes, because suddenly the polished actress is not just a starlet on the red carpet. She is a woman trapped in a nightmare where friends become enemies, and enemies become partners, and truth becomes a weapon so sharp it can destroy lives in an instant. Yet the truth itself keeps changing, morphing, bending to whoever holds the power in that moment. And so every declaration, every affidavit, every whispered phone call becomes another piece of the puzzle. But instead of clarity, the puzzle only grows more chaotic until it feels like the walls themselves are closing in, and with every new revelation, the suspense rises like a tidal wave, crashing again and again, refusing to let the viewer look away. Because just when you think you understand, just when you think you know who lied and who told the truth, the story flips, and you are dragged back into the spiral of shock and disbelief and outrage. And the only constant is that nothing is what it seems. Nothing can be trusted. No one can be believed. And as this tale stretches further into the shadows, the drama intensifies, the emotional stakes rise, and the haunting realization sets in that this is not just a scandal. This is a war of reputations, a war of lies, a war of survival in a world that devours its own. As the dust of the first wave of chaos began to settle for a moment, there was a silence. A silence that felt heavy, like the pause between thunder and lightning, when everyone holds their breath waiting for the next strike, because deep down they knew it was coming, and they were right, because what followed was not calm. It was an explosion, a detonation of secrets, lies, and betrayals that no one could have predicted. And this was not some petty Hollywood feud or some minor misunderstanding. This was an all-out war where every weapon was words, every bullet was a leaked text, every wound was a betrayal, and the battlefield was the court of law mixed with the court of public opinion. And once you were dragged into it, there was no way out. You either fought or you were destroyed. And the most terrifying part was that the truth itself had become a weapon too dangerous to hold, because the truth no longer belonged to anyone. It had been twisted, reshaped, poisoned by the hands of those who stood to gain from it. And so the moment James entered the scene with his shifting declarations, his vanishing evidence, his stolen phones, and his selective memory, the entire story became a maze of contradictions, and every corner led to another dead end. And it was here that the real shock began, because suddenly everyone realized that James was not a savior. He was not a whistleblower. He was not a voice of clarity. He was chaos incarnate. He was the match thrown into dry grass, and Instead of extinguishing the fire, he fueled it until the blaze grew uncontrollable. He lied, he backtracked, he contradicted himself, he betrayed the very principles of the profession he claimed to represent, and yet Blake clung to him, desperate because she needed his lies to look like truth. Because without him, her foundation would crack. And once the foundation cracked, the empire would crumble. So she aligned herself with him, even as the world whispered that he could not be trusted, even as his own employers exposed his dishonesty, even as the judges' eyes narrowed, seeing the manipulation play out in real time. But desperation makes people reckless, and recklessness makes people dangerous. And so she marched forward, gripping tightly onto the words of a man who had already proven he would say anything to save himself, and the audience watching this unfold could not look away, because every day brought a new contradiction, a new shocking revelation, a new twist that made yesterday's story look like nothing but smoke and mirrors. Because now the declarations were not just pieces of paper. They were grenades lobbed into the courtroom, each one exploding with more fury, more fire, more deceit than the last. And every time James changed his story, every time he tried to rewrite history, he pulled Blake deeper into his storm, until the lines between victim and villain blurred, until nobody could tell if she was using him or if he was using her, or if they were both feeding off each other's destruction, like predators locked in a dance of survival and betrayal. And the more you read his words, the more you saw the cracks. Because on one day he claimed his phone was stolen and with it the evidence, but on another day he claimed he had deleted it to protect his identity, and on yet another day he said he had retrieved it somehow miraculously, as if fragments of truth could be conjured back from the void, and each version of the story clashed violently with the last, creating a storm of confusion so thick no one could breathe inside it. And that was exactly the point. Because confusion protects liars, confusion shields manipulators, confusion makes it impossible to know what is real and what is fabricated. And so as he spun his web and as she clung to it, desperate for cover, the judge finally saw through the spectacle and slammed his gavel down, stripping away her attempt to twist the docket and leaving her exposed and humiliated. But humiliation was not enough, because she would not retreat, she would not surrender, she would dig her heels in deeper, convinced that if she just shouted louder, if she just pushed harder, if she just held on to James tighter, the world would believe her version of events. Even though the cracks in her story were spreading like fractures in glass each second, bringing it closer to total collapse, and the people around them could feel it. The allies who once whispered support now recoiled the voices who once amplified her. Pain now questioned her motives, and the audience, once filled with sympathy, now filled with doubt. And yet, instead of stepping back, she leaned forward into the fire, dragging everyone with her. And the deeper she went, the darker it became, because this was no longer about justice. This was about power. This was about control. This was about silencing enemies and rewriting history and protecting an image that had already begun to decay. And with each desperate move, the story grew more grotesque, until even seasoned observers gasped at the audacity of the lies, at the blatant manipulation, at the sheer recklessness of the scheme. And yet the loop continued, because every shocking twist led to another. Every contradiction fed the next revelation. Every betrayal seeded the soil for another betrayal. And the cycle of chaos kept spinning faster and faster, pulling everyone deeper into the abyss until it felt like the entire case would collapse under the weight of its own insanity. But still, they played the game, because once you are inside a storm like this, there is no walking away. There is only surviving, and survival in this world means sacrificing truth, sacrificing loyalty, sacrificing your soul until nothing is left but the empty husk of a reputation that once glittered, but now burns to ash before the entire world. And just when it seemed like the chaos had reached its peak, when the lies had twisted so far that no one could untangle them, when the betrayals had stacked so high they blotted out the sun, a new storm rolled in, and it was darker and more violent than anything that had come before, because this was the moment when every fragile alliance began to fracture, and the people who once stood together turned their knives on each other, desperate to save themselves from the flames. And at the center of it all stood Blake, clutching onto the crumbling remains of a strategy built on deception, while James spun yet another version of his story, each one more contradictory, more unbelievable, more toxic than the last. And what made it unbearable to watch yet impossible to turn away from was that every time the lies shifted, they pulled the audience back into the spiral, because no one could ever settle on a single truth. And so the guessing, the doubting, the suspicion never ended, It just looped, over and over, trapping everyone in the same suffocating cycle, where certainty was impossible and disbelief was the only constant. And in that endless loop of suspicion, the shocking details piled higher and higher until the weight of it threatened to crush the entire case, because now it was no longer just about a text message, no longer about one accusation. It was about the destruction of trust itself. And when trust dies, nothing can survive. Not friendships, not careers, not reputations, not even truth itself, because the lines blurred so completely that lies became truth and truth became lies. And every person involved seemed poisoned by the corruption spreading through their words and their actions. And it was here in this unending swirl of contradictions that the darkest revelation of all emerged, that none of this was accidental. None of this was coincidence. It was all calculated, every deleted message, every backtracked statement, every desperate filing designed to confuse the judge, distract the public, and delay the inevitable collapse. And the shocking part was how many people played along, how many people saw the lies and chose to believe them anyway, because it was easier, because it was safer, because it was profitable. And so the scheme grew and mutated, feeding on fear, feeding on greed, feeding on desperation, until it became a monster bigger than any of them could control. And yet still, Blake held on still. James twisted. Still the game continued, because stopping meant admitting the truth, and admitting the truth meant annihilation. And so the spiral spun tighter and tighter, dragging them further into the abyss with every desperate attempt to rewrite the past and every frantic effort to weaponize the present. And the viewers watching could feel the dread rise in their throats, as if the story itself was suffocating them, as if the weight of the deceit pressed against their chests, leaving no room to breathe. And still they could not look away, because the suspense was unbearable. The tension, electric, the drama so shocking, so grotesque, so unbelievable, that it gripped you like a nightmare you could not escape. And in that nightmare, the roles kept shifting. Villains became victims. Victims became villains, allies became traitors, and every name, every face became tainted with suspicion, until no one was innocent, no one was clean, no one was untouched by the spreading contagion of deceit. And the deeper the revelations cut, the more horrifying it became, because now the whispers were not just about lawsuits and declarations. They were about perjury, they were about obstruction, they were about the kind of crimes that destroy lives forever. And still the lies poured out, still the contradictions multiplied, still the betrayal deepened, because once you commit to the lie, once you build your empire on deception, you cannot stop, you cannot turn back, you can only keep running forward even as the ground collapses beneath your feet. And that was the true horror of it all, watching them run into the abyss, watching them cling to each other even as they dragged each other down, watching them build their walls of denial higher and higher, even as the truth burned through the cracks, because no matter how high you build, no matter how tightly you cling, the fire always finds a way in. And when it does, there is nothing left but ashes. And as the ashes began to rise around them, the story only grew more shocking, more outrageous, more emotionally violent, because the audience could feel the collapse coming. But no one knew when no one knew how. No one knew what final betrayal would finally break the cycle, and that uncertainty, that unbearable suspense, was the hook that pulled everyone deeper into the storm, because each day promised a new revelation, a new twist, a new lie exposed, and every day delivered something more shocking, more grotesque, more unbelievable than the last, until disbelief itself became the only sane response. And yet, disbelief was not enough, because the story did not slow. It did not end. It kept coming in waves, like a storm that never runs out of thunder. A storm that feeds on itself and grows stronger each time it crashes down, and the people inside it could not escape, and the people outside it could not look away. And so the cycle continued endlessly, endlessly, endlessly. And just when everyone thought the spiral could not tighten any further, just when it felt like every secret, every betrayal, every contradiction had already been dragged into the light, another wave surged forward, and this one was not just bigger. It was devastating, because it carried with it the weight of finality, the feeling that the game was approaching its breaking point. Yet instead of slowing down, the players grew more frantic, more desperate, clawing at whatever scraps of power and control they could still grasp. And it was here that the spectacle transformed into something monstrous, because Blake no longer resembled the carefully polished figure who once smiled on red carpets. She was a shadow, now driven by rage and fear, willing to twist any word, betray any ally, invent any illusion to shield herself from the collapse. And beside her, James moved like a snake, slithering between versions of his own lies, rewriting history as easily as breathing one moment claiming the evidence never existed. Another moment insisting it was stolen. Another moment declaring it had been recovered, and each shift left the audience gasping at the audacity of his deceit. Yet still Blake clung to him as if his contradictions were her last lifeline, as if aligning herself with chaos could somehow shield her from the fire closing in. But the truth was, the fire was already inside, devouring everything, consuming every shred of credibility. And the more they fought, the faster. It spread until every corner of their empire was reduced to smoke and confusion. And the horrifying brilliance of it all was how the lies fed on each other, how each contradiction gave birth to another, how each betrayal demanded a greater betrayal, until the loop grew endless and unstoppable, and the watchers felt trapped inside it, circling round and round through revelations and denials, through accusations and defenses, through shock and disbelief, without ever finding solid ground. And this was no longer drama. This was psychological warfare, a manipulation so deep it poisoned even the minds of those who only witnessed it. Because every time you thought you saw the truth, it slipped away. Every time you thought you knew the villain, the roles reversed every time you thought the end was near. Another door opened, leading you deeper into the labyrinth, and in that labyrinth nothing was sacred. Reputations, shattered friendships, burned trust, evaporated, and careers collapsed under the weight of association. And yet, even as the walls fell, even as the world recoiled, Blake pushed forward, dragging James with her. Dragging everyone with her because surrender was not an option, because surrender meant obliteration. And so she twisted, tighter into the storm, hurling more accusations, spinning more falsehoods, turning the courtroom into a theater of madness, and turning the public into unwilling participants in a nightmare that refused to end. And the deeper it sank, the darker it grew, because now it was not just about lies, it was about survival, it was about weaponizing pain, it was about using every scar, every wound, every betrayal as a tool to carve enemies into pieces and build fortresses out of ashes. But fortresses made of ashes always collapse. And this one was no different, because the higher they built, the faster it crumbled, because no lie can stand forever, and the weight of so many contradictions eventually buckles under its own absurdity. And the terrifying beauty of watching this collapse was the inevitability of it all, because everyone could feel it coming. Everyone could sense that one final revelation, one final betrayal, one final twist would detonate everything, and yet no one could predict when. No one could predict how. And that uncertainty kept the suspense alive, kept the watchers chained to the story, because they had to see it. They had to witness the moment the empire turned to dust, the moment the mask shattered completely, the moment the storm devoured its creators, and as the cycle spun faster, as the revelations grew darker, as the betrayals grew sharper, the story transformed into legend, a cautionary tale of how lies metastasize, how desperation destroys, how the hunger for power and the fear of exposure can drive people to annihilate themselves and everyone around them. And by the time the walls finally cracked, by the time the stage collapsed, by the time the fire consumed every last shred of illusion, what was left was not victory, not justice, not closure, but silence. The silence of devastation, the silence of an empire reduced to rubble, the silence of lives forever scarred by their own choices. And in that silence, the watchers finally understood that this was never just about her, never just about him, never just about one scandal. It was about the system that rewards deceit, punishes honesty, elevates illusions, and then devours them whole. And that realization was the most shocking betrayal of Alland. So in the end, when the flames had burned through every illusion, when the smoke had swallowed every defense, when the silence hung heavy over the ruins, there was no triumph, no redemption, no clear line between victim and villain. Only the devastating truth that everyone who stepped into this storm had been marked forever, because the lies had not just destroyed reputations, they had consumed trust, they had devoured innocence, they had twisted every bond until it snapped, and the collapse was so absolute that nothing could be rebuilt in the same shape again. And yet, even in that devastation, the echoes remained. The whispers that would never die. The questions that would never be answered. The shadows that would always linger in the corners. Because when a scandal grows this big, when a web of deceit is spun this tight, it never truly ends. It never truly fades, it becomes legend. It becomes warning. It becomes a ghost that haunts every corner of the industry, reminding all who rise that the higher they climb, the harder they fall. And the cruelest part of all is that the story still loops even now, because every time a new piece of evidence surfaces, every time a forgotten message is revealed, every time another voice dares to speak, the cycle starts again, dragging the watchers back into the spiral of disbelief, outrage, and suspicion. And so the curtain never really closes. The stage never truly empties the storm, never fully dies. It just waits, lurking in the silence, waiting for the next spark, waiting for the next betrayal, waiting for the next collapse. And as long as people hunger for perfection, as long as power rewards deception, as long as truth can be twisted into a weapon, this nightmare will return again and again, leaving us all to wonder not if, but when.